The silence in Riven's study was a physical thing, a weight of polished wood and old paper, and the accumulated stillness of 400 years. Tonight, it felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. He sat behind the massive oak desk and stared at the single sheet of vellum on the blotter. The script was precise, elegant, and it described a violation so profound it had no name. He had read it 3 times. The words had not changed. Aconitum noctis, night bloom. A slow-acting alkaloid poison distilled from a rare hybrid of monkshood cultivated only in the deepest vaults of the old world. It did not kill, not at first. It simply leached. It attacked the blood itself, corrupting the ancient regenerative properties that sustained their kind. It mimicked blood thinning, the degradation of a vampire whose bloodline was weakening under the weight of centuries. The cruelest property of Nightbloom was its effect on perception. In its earliest stages, it dulled the preternatural senses: taste, smell, the fine-tuned awareness that was every vampire's birthright. The subject would not detect the taint in their own blood, because the poison's first act was to blind the palate that might have caught it. A vampire being dosed with Nightbloom would drink the corrupted blood and taste nothing amiss. They would simply feel themselves fading night after night and have no reason to question the glass in their hand. It mimicked everything he had blamed himself for. For 14 months, he had watched Thalia fade. He, who could discern the lie in a courtier's heartbeat from 50 paces, had been blind. He had brought in blood alchemists, elder healers, physicians. They had diagnosed blood fatigue, bond strain, the slow erosion that sometimes claimed vampires. Her blood was losing its potency. And he had believed them. His guilt had been a constant grinding engine in the quiet of his chest, a space where his heart beat only once every few minutes, but where ache could still reside, slow and deep as a tide. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. Thalia, 3 months ago, her hand in his. Her skin, always a shade warmer than his own, had felt thin, papery. She'd smiled, a tired, gentle curve of her lips. "I'm sorry, Riven. I just don't have the strength tonight. Maybe tomorrow." He remembered the woman she had been before the decline. Sharp-minded, meticulous, the kind of thinker who could untangle a century of coven finances in a single sitting and find the one misallocated tithe that explained everything. She had managed the accounts of 3 allied houses in her 2nd century, a role the old guard had sneered at, too mercantile, too common for a queen, but one that had saved those houses from ruin. She had a mind like a ledger, precise, patient, and merciless in its accounting. The poison had not just stolen her strength, it had stolen the confidence she had in that mind. The woman who had once caught a 40-year embezzlement scheme in a single night's reading couldn't trust herself to stay awake through a meal. Now she apologized for not having the energy to walk to the garden. He had smoothed the silver pale hair from her brow and felt the vast, helpless weight of his centuries. He could command armies, reshape territories, outlive the decay of empires. But he could not renew her blood. He could not stop the slow, insidious drain he feared was a flaw in her turning. A turning he had performed himself 300 years ago when she had chosen him with the fierce, clear-eyed certainty that had made him fall in love with her. "You have nothing to apologize for," he had murmured, and the lie tasted like ash. He had believed her weakness was his fault, a flaw in his blood passed to her, a sin of the sire. Now the healer's report offered a different, more terrible truth. It wasn't his fault. It was his failure. The door opened without a sound. Alara stood on the threshold, a slim silhouette against the candelabra light of the corridor. She was young by their standards, barely a century old, with a mind that was unnervingly modern. She did not trust tradition. She trusted evidence. It was why he had summoned her. It was why she had succeeded where all the others, with their ancient remedies and pronouncements, had failed. "My lord," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the frantic bird-wing flutter of her heart, a sound only audible because it beat so rarely. He didn't look up from the report. "Administered how?" His voice was flat, a stone skipping across a frozen lake. In her blood rations, Ilara confirmed. Trace amounts, consistently. Most likely introduced during the evening's prepared draft, blended in the lower cellars. It metabolizes within the blood quickly. By dawn rest, it would be undetectable by conventional means. Of course, the others had looked for the ghost. She had looked for the grave. Another memory. Talia, turning away from the crystal goblet of prepared blood, her appetite gone. He had sat with her, his own hunger a dull throb, and watched her push the vessel away with a grimace. He'd thought it was the quality of the blood, or the staleness of their supply. The truth was that her sustenance was poisoned, a slow, methodical corruption night after night. 14 months of it. Over 400 prepared drafts laced with a lie. Who? The word was barely a breath. Ilara took a half step into the room. The report details the chemistry, my lord, not the politics. I found what was in her blood. Who put it there is beyond my sight. But it was not beyond his. He didn't need names. He had the motive. A consort from a lesser bloodline weakens the crown. The whispers had been circulating for a year, faint as moth wings. He had dismissed them as the grumbling of an entrenched old guard, resentful of a woman from the Ashbourne line holding a place of honor at his side. He had not seen the whispers as a statement of intent. He had grown complacent, insulated by centuries of power. Lord Valerius, with his talk of purity and precedent. Lady Isolde, whose ambition was a perfume she wore, sharp and cloying. And Cassian, his own second, whose loyalty had always been laced with a pragmatism that bordered on contempt. They had tried to erase Talia, to make her fade away so quietly that even she would believe it was her own nature. A bloodline too thin, a turning too flawed, a woman simply not strong enough for the throne. Riven's focus narrowed. The rage was unlike any he had felt in a century. It was not the hot fury of battle. It was a cold, cosmic fury. The fury of an ancient watching insects torture something beautiful for no reason at all. He had lived through plagues and pogroms, seen cities burn and brethren turn to dust in the sun. He had learned one lesson above all others. You do not show your hand. You let them see the judgment, the sentence, the end, but never the anger that drives it. Anger was a weakness, a vulnerability. He folded the vellum in half, the crease sharp and perfect. The sound was like a bone snapping in the deep quiet. Ilara flinched. My lord? He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. In the candlelight, his eyes burned violet, a deep, bruised purple that could shift to pale amethyst or darken to near black depending on his mood. His silver-white hair, falling in loose waves just past his shoulders, caught the flame light and turned it to liquid mercury. There was a reason the old poets had called him the sovereign of the obsidian throne. His beauty was not human, not mortal, not even truly vampiric. It was something older and stranger. A face carved by whatever cruel hand shaped the first of their kind. All sharp, perfect symmetry, and a mouth that could look like a prayer or a blade, depending on the angle. He had consciously arranged that devastating face into a mask of calm consideration. He knew what she would see, not the inferno behind his violet eyes, but the unsettling stillness of a predator that has just chosen its prey. It was a look that had ended blood feuds and toppled lesser courts. You have done the crown a service, Ilara, he said, his voice a low resonance that vibrated in the air. This information does not leave this room. Your discretion will be rewarded. She bowed her head and retreated, understanding that she had just handed a king a declaration of war, leaving him once more alone with the truth. He sat there for another minute. Or maybe it was an hour. Time had become elastic, stretching and snapping. He thought of Thalia, likely in her chambers, perhaps already deep in the dawn rest, her breath a soft, shallow rhythm in the dark. He thought of her apologies. "I'm sorry I'm so tired. I'm sorry I'm not stronger. I'm sorry." Every apology was a fresh stab. They had not just poisoned her blood, they had poisoned her perception of herself. They had taken her strength and convinced her it was weakness. And he, in his guilt and his ignorance, had let them. He had questioned her blood. He had questioned her bond. He had questioned everything, except the glass in her hand. It had never occurred to him. The blood was prepared in his cellars, by his staff, under his command. The idea that the threat could be that mundane, that domestic, had simply not existed in his mind. The cold rage began to burn. The mask was cracking. He needed to move. He needed to act. Valerius, Isolde, Cassian. He could picture it. 3 movements, faster than a mortal eye could follow. A compressed burst of violence over in 3 seconds. But his first move was not toward the throne room. His first duty was not to his crown, not to his vengeance. It was to her. He had to undo the lie. He had to give her back the truth of herself before he took everything from them. He stood and walked out of the study. The silence that followed him was no longer a fortress. It was the calm before a storm. The halls of the citadel were arteries of shadow and stone, pulsing with the faint subliminal hum of 100 sleeping immortals. To a human, they would have been silent. To Riven, they were a symphony of secrets. Tonight, every sound was amplified, sharpened by the cold fury that had settled in his bones. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every flicker of candlelight a potential betrayal. He walked not with his usual measured grace, but with a coiled stillness, a predator's containment. His speed was a temptation, a promise of violence to come. He forced himself to take each step, to feel the cold stone beneath his boots. This walk was a penance, a pilgrimage across the terrain of his own failure. Her chambers were at the heart of the citadel, a suite of rooms that overlooked the night garden, where silver birches and ghost orchids caught the moonlight and held it. It was the most beautiful view the citadel offered under the stars, and she had loved it from the first night. The sire bond between them, that deep, wordless current that had connected them since the night he turned her 3 centuries ago, had been screaming for months. He knew that now. But the bond did not transmit facts. It transmitted feeling. And what he had felt from her was a low, steady tide of exhaustion, of doubt, of quiet resignation. He had interpreted it as confirmation of his worst fear, that his blood was failing her, that his turning had been flawed, that she was slipping away and there was nothing he could do. He had felt her suffering and used it as evidence against himself. He had heard her drowning and mistaken it for the sound of the sea. The bond had not failed. He had. He dismissed the guards with a curt gesture. "Leave us. I will watch over her tonight." He was alone before her door. He paused, his hand on the cold iron latch. He was about to bring the war into her sanctuary. There was a unique cruelty in it, but it was a necessary one. The lie had to be burned away. He entered. The room was warm, warmer than most vampires preferred, a small vanity Thalia had always allowed herself. The air was filled with the scent of dried lavender and old books, and Thalia herself, a scent like night-blooming jasmine and old amber, a scent that had, for 14 months, been tainted with a faint, acrid undertone he hadn't been able to name. Now he could. It was the smell of night bloom. He had been smelling the poison on her for over a year, and had mistaken it for the scent of her own blood weakening. She was not in the dawn rest. She was curled in a heavy armchair near the hearth, where a low fire painted the room in strokes of orange and gold. A thick book lay open in her lap, but her head was resting against the velvet upholstery, her eyes closed. She looked ethereal in the flickering light, a figure from a pre-Raphaelite painting, all tired grace and sharp cheekbones. The sight of her, so still and fragile seeming, was what he had found beautiful and heartbreaking for months. Now it was an indictment. She sensed his presence. Her eyes fluttered open, the dark amber of her irises catching the firelight like whiskey held to a flame. A soft smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those were shadowed with a familiar, bone-deep weariness. "Riven," she murmured, her voice a little rough. She made a small movement to sit up straighter, a gesture he had seen 1,000 times. It was an apology in motion. "I'm sorry for being found wanting." "Don't," he said. The word was sharper than he intended. She froze, her smile faltering. "Is something wrong?" He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, the fury in him so tightly leashed it was a vibration in his own limbs. He knelt before her chair, a gesture he had not made to anyone in centuries. It put their eyes on a level. He wanted her to see him. He needed to see her. He took in the faint, grayish shadows beneath her eyes, the pallor of her skin that was not the luminous alabaster of a well-fed vampire, but the sallow, dull tint of chronic blood starvation. Evidence. All of it. Evidence of a crime he had failed to see. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a second before he allowed himself the contact. His cool skin against hers, still warmer, but less than it should have been. Their temperatures had always been close, 2 variations of the same chill, but hers had dropped over the months. And then her hand moved, not to take his, but upward, automatically, to his hair. Her fingers threaded through the silver-white strands, a gesture so old and so habitual that she did it even now, even exhausted, even before she fully understood why he was kneeling before her. It was their oldest ritual, older than any court ceremony, older than any oath. 300 years of it. Her hand in his hair. It said, "I'm here. You're here. That is enough." He closed his eyes against her touch the way he always did, a fraction of that otherworldly composure falling away to reveal something achingly, privately tender. "You were never weak," he said. The words came out low and guttural, torn from a place deeper than his lungs. Thalia stared at him. Confusion clouded her tired eyes. What? It was a simple question, but it held the weight of 14 months of doubt, of self-recrimination, of her believing she was failing him, failing herself. He said nothing. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew the folded vellum. He held it out to her. Her gaze shifted from his face to the paper. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She unfolded it. He watched her face as she read. He watched her eyes scan the elegant script, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then, in dawning confusion, he saw the exact moment she understood. It wasn't a gasp. It wasn't a cry. It was a sudden, absolute stillness, as if all the blood in her veins had stopped circulating. The vellum crackled in her grip. Her eyes, wide and dark, lifted to his. They were stripped bare of everything but a raw, dawning horror. "How long?" Her voice was a shard of glass. He had known she would ask. The word still felt like a betrayal. 14 months. She didn't react at first. Then she looked down at her own hands, at the paper she was crushing without realizing it. A single, tearless sob escaped her, a sound of pure, hollowed-out pain. She looked back at him, and her voice was terrifyingly calm. 14 months of me thinking something was wrong with me. Her gaze dropped to the goblet on the side table, the evening's draft she had not yet touched. "I couldn't even taste it," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "I drank it every night, every single night, Riven. And I thought the blood was fine. I thought it was me that was wrong, and I didn't even have the senses left to question it." That was it. That was the line. It was not the crime itself, not the poison, not the political treachery. It was that simple, devastating sentence. It was the theft of her self-trust. It was the quiet, methodical, psychological dismantling of the woman he loved, carried out under his own roof. Something inside him, a restraint he had honed over 4 centuries, did not just break, it vaporized. The cold, controlled fury became a white-hot nova of agony. A sound tore from his throat, not a roar, but something worse. A deep, resonant snarl that dropped below the range of mortal hearing and shook the stone itself. It was the sound of his failure made manifest. The air in the room crackled, the flames in the hearth leaping up as if in fear. He slammed a fist into the stone floor beside him, and the flagstone split clean in two, a jagged crack running outward like a fault line. Thalia flinched back, her eyes wide with shock. He saw her shock, and it was like a bucket of ice water on the fire. He immediately reined himself in, the effort monumental. He forced his fist to uncurl. He forced himself to breathe. "They will pay for this," he growled, the words of vow, a promise of utter annihilation. "Thalia, they will—" "It wasn't me," she interrupted, her voice barely audible. She was still looking at her hands. "It wasn't my blood failing. It wasn't my turning unraveling. It was them." He reached for her, his hands trembling with the force of his contained rage. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her from the chair and onto his lap, holding her against his chest. She was trembling now, a fine, full-body tremor of shock and delayed rage. He held her tight, and she let him, her face pressed against the hollow of his throat, where his pulse beat, once, twice, in the long silence between. He could feel the frantic, unsteady flutter of her own slow heart. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, now irrevocably mingled with the ghost of her poison. "It was never you," he whispered into the crown of her head, the words a desperate prayer. "It was always them, and they are already dead. They just don't know it yet." But as he held her, a more chilling thought took root. He could kill them. He could wipe their names from the records, salt the earth of their ancestral crypts. But he couldn't give Talia back those 14 months. He couldn't erase the memory of her own self-doubt. The purge would be a release for him. For her, the battle had just begun. The court did not see it happen. They only saw the aftermath. One moment, Lord Valerius was in the library, a rare vintage of Venetian blood wine breathing in a decanter at his elbow as he perused a genealogy chart. The next, the book was on the floor, its spine broken, and a dark stain of ancient vita was spreading across the priceless Aubusson carpet. The decanter was untouched. The wine was still breathing. Valerius was not. Lady Isolde was in her solarium, admiring the pale spectral blooms of her moon orchids. She had been cultivating them for 60 years, a hobby that required patience and a delicate touch. She heard a sound, the barest whisper of displaced air. She turned, a question forming on her lips. It never found voice. Later, her handmaiden would find her among the shattered blossoms, a single, perfect moon orchid crushed in her hand. Cassian was in the armory. He was Riven's second, a pragmatist. He believed in steel, in strategy, in strength. He did not believe in ghosts. Which is why, when Riven appeared before him, not having entered through the door, but simply being there, Cassian's first thought was tactical. He had been outmaneuvered. He didn't even have time to lift his sword. Riven's hand closed around his throat, the grip not crushing, but absolute. Cassian looked up into a face that might have been sculpted by an angel with a grudge. All that devastating, unearthly beauty turned to a weapon. The silver-white hair fell around Riven's face like a curtain of frost, and his eyes, those impossible violet eyes, were empty. They were the void between stars. "She thought it was her fault," Riven said. His voice was not a shout. It was a quiet, conversational statement of fact. And it was the most terrifying sound Cassian had ever heard. 3 seconds of real time. That's all it took for the heart of the conspiracy to stop beating. 1 second for Valerius, 1 for Isolde, 1 for Cassian. A full paragraph of silent, compressed violence stretched across the citadel. There were no screams. There was no struggle. There was only the sudden, jarring absence of 3 powerful, ancient lives, snuffed out like candle flames pinched between cold fingers. The rest of the court learned of it at dusk, the hour of waking. A servant's shriek from the library. A handmaiden's collapse in the solarium. The discovery of the master of the guard in the armory, his sword lying beside him like a fallen comrade. By the time the moon was high in the sky, a silver eye watching through breaks in the clouds, the entire citadel was paralyzed by a fear so profound it was a physical pressure. The air grew thick with it. No one spoke above a whisper. Every shadow held a question, and no one wanted the answer. Riven called a formal court assembly in the throne room an hour later. The great hall, usually buzzing with conversation, was utterly silent. The remaining members of the council stood at their places, their faces pale even by vampiric standards, their eyes fixed on the 3 empty chairs. They were not draped in black, they were simply empty. The absence was louder than any eulogy. Riven stood before the throne, not seated on it. He was dressed in simple black, the fabric stark against the silver fall of his hair. The candlelight loved him, turning his white hair to a halo of pale fire, and deepening his violet eyes to something that looked almost holy. He looked rested. He looked calm. This, more than anything, was what terrified them. He let the silence stretch, letting it work its way into their bones. He swept his gaze across their faces, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Lord Valerius, Lady Isolde, and Commander Cassian have been removed from their positions, Riven announced, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet. He did not say they were dead. He said they were removed, as if they were stains on a tapestry. Their service to this court is concluded. A collective, silent intake of breath. The finality was absolute. This is a time of change, Riven continued, his voice as smooth and cold as river stone. Old ideas, like old alliances, can become a sickness, a poison. This court has been sick. I have administered the cure. The sickness is gone. We will be healthy now. He looked directly at Thalia, who stood slightly behind the throne, near the shadows of a great pillar. She was pale, dressed in a simple gray gown, but her chin was up. Her eyes were clear. For the first time in 14 months, they were not clouded by fatigue. They were filled with a terrible, crystalline clarity. She was not a victim. She was a witness. The court saw it. They saw her standing there, no longer the fading consort, but the cause, the fulcrum. The quiet, powerful woman for whom 3 of the most influential vampires had ceased to exist in a single night. In their eyes, she transformed. She was no longer a weakness. She was a symbol of the king's terrifying, absolute devotion. Riven turned his back on the assembly, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to her side. He offered her his arm. She took it. Together they walked from the throne room, leaving the stunned, silent court to stare at the 3 empty chairs and contemplate the new and brutal mathematics of power. The purge was over. The message had been sent, received, and understood. But as they walked back toward their private chambers, Riven felt the slight tremor in Thalia's hand on his arm, and he knew the war was far from won. The bodies were gone, but the ghosts remained. The antidote was as brutal as the poison had been subtle. It was a flood where the night bloom had been a leak. For 3 days, Thalia's world was a nauseous, spinning blur. Alara, the healer, was a constant, calm presence, her voice a low murmur explaining the process. The antidote, a compound derived from sun-blessed silver ash and ancient vitae, was forcing the accumulated toxins from her blood. The process was violent. It felt like every vein in her body was being scoured from the inside out. She was sick in a way she had never been before. A clean, purposeful sickness, not the creeping, soul-deep weariness she had mistaken for her own nature. This sickness had an end point. The other had felt like a slow descent into nothing. On the 4th night, she woke from the dawn rest, and the nausea was gone. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, taking inventory. She waited for the familiar weight to settle on her limbs, the fog to creep into the edges of her mind. It didn't come. Slowly, she sat up. No wave of dizziness, no immediate need to lie back down. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and planted her feet on the cold stone floor. She stood. The room remained stable. Her body felt light, empty. Not in a bad way, but like a vessel that had been filled with sand and was now, finally, hollow and ready for use. She could feel her blood humming in her veins with a vitality she had forgotten she possessed. The regenerative power that defined their kind was surging through her like a river breaking through a dam. She took a step, then another. She walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. The night sky was a vault of stars, and the courtyard below was bathed in cool, blue moonlight. She could see the faint shapes of gardeners tending the night-blooming jasmine. For the first time in over a year, the thought of walking down there did not feel monumental. It felt like something she could do. The relief was so staggering, it buckled her knees. She gripped the stone windowsill, her knuckles white. It wasn't me. The thought was a mantra, a prayer, a weapon. It wasn't me. But the ghost of the lie was tenacious. In the nights that followed, as her physical strength returned with startling speed, her vampiric regeneration kicking in properly for the first time in over a year, she found her mind was still tracked in the old patterns. She would wake, and her first thought would be, how tired am I tonight? How much can I get done before I have to rest? She would have to consciously, deliberately replace it. I am not tired. I am strong. I can do what I want. Riven was a shadow at her side, a silent, watchful guardian. His guilt was a palpable thing. He watched her every movement with fierce pride, laced with agonizing self-reproach. His presence was both a comfort and a cage. He was trying to give her the world, to make up for what had been stolen. A week after the purge, she decided to test herself. She went to the small sitting room attached to her chambers, where she kept old alchemical tools, a hobby from her first century. She decided to prepare a simple tincture. The motions were simple. Measure the dried herbs, heat the solvent over a small flame, grind the base in the stone mortar. But as she lifted the heavy mortar, her arm faltered. An echo of weakness, a ghost memory of her muscles trembling. Her hand shook. The mortar clattered against the flask, and something inside her snapped. A surge of rage, white-hot and pure, burned through the fog of her recovery. It wasn't directed at the conspirators. They were dead. This anger was for herself, for the part of her that had believed the lie so completely it had become a physical reflex. She slammed the mortar down on the marble counter. I am not weak, she hissed to the empty chamber. Thalia? Riven was there, appearing in the doorway, his silver-white hair catching the lamplight. His beautiful face was a mask of alarm. In an instant, he was at her side, his hands hovering near her, ready. Let me, he said gently, reaching for the mortar. That's heavy. And that was the final straw. She snatched her hand back as if burned. No, don't you dare. He froze, his hand in mid-air, confusion and hurt in his violet eyes. Don't treat me like I'm made of glass, she said, her voice trembling with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. I am not the patient anymore, Riven. For 14 months, I thought I was breaking. I thought my blood was thinning, my turning was unraveling, that my body was a prison. I believed I was failing. Do you have any idea what that feels like? I need to lift this mortar. I need to walk the battlements. I need to feel my own strength and know that it's mine. And I can't do that if you are always here, waiting for me to falter. Your guilt is a heavier burden than this mortar ever was. She saw the words land. They hit him with more force than any physical blow. The hurt in his eyes deepened into something raw. He slowly lowered his hand and took a step back, creating distance between them. It was the first time in a week he had willingly put distance between them. "I see," he said, his voice a low rasp. He looked lost, a king without a kingdom. Thalia's anger deflated, leaving a hollow ache. She hadn't meant to be cruel, but she needed to breathe. She needed to find her own footing. She deliberately picked up the mortar. It felt solid, manageable in her hand. Her muscles didn't tremble. She poured the ground mixture into the flask, the sharp scent of dried rosemary and ironroot filling the air. She did not look at him. She focused on the task, this small, mundane act of reclamation. When she was done, she set the mortar down with a soft click. She finally turned to face him. He hadn't moved. He was just watching her, his stillness absolute, a statue of silver and shadow. "I need some space, Riven," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to remember who I was before this." He gave a single, slow nod. His face was unreadable, the mask back in place. But she could feel the turmoil, a silent, raging sea. Without another word, he turned and was gone, moving with that preternatural silence that still, after 3 centuries, could make her breath catch. Thalia stood alone in the quiet room, the scent of herbs in the air. She had her strength back, but she was beginning to realize that in order to truly heal, she might have to break the heart of the man who had saved her. The gardens of the Citadel were a paradox, a testament to the vampire's strange relationship with the natural world. There were no sun-loving roses or cheerful daisies. Instead, there were groves of silver birch that looked ethereal under the moon, beds of ghost orchids, and sprawling patches of night-blooming jasmine. And in a secluded, walled-off section at the northern edge, there was the aconite garden. This was where the night bloom was cultivated. It had been Isolde's private domain. It was here that Thalia went. She needed to see it. She needed to confront the source. The night after her confrontation with Riven, she walked there alone. He kept his promise, keeping his distance, though she felt his awareness like a faint pressure on her skin, the sire bond humming with his worry. He was watching, but from afar. It was enough. The gate to the aconite garden was locked. A new lock, heavy and iron. A message from Riven. "This place is forbidden." She stood before it, her hand resting on the cold metal. His instinct was to lock the danger away. Hers was to face it. She found a gardener, an ancient vampire named Silas, who had been tending the Citadel's grounds since before Riven was born. His skin was weathered like old leather, his movements deliberate. He preferred the patience of growing things. "I need the key to this garden," Thalia said, her voice steady. Silas looked from her to the gate, his ancient eyes placid. "The king ordered it sealed." "The king is not the master of this garden anymore," she replied, surprising herself with her own audacity. "Lady Isolde is gone. I will tend it." The old gardener studied her for a long moment. He had seen consorts come and go. He had seen kings rise and fall. He was not easily impressed. But he saw something in her dark amber eyes, not dimness, but the hardened resolve of a survivor. He gave a slow, creaking nod. "As you wish." He produced a key from a ring at his belt and handed it to her. The air inside the walled garden was different, colder. The plants grew in unnaturally neat rows, organized with chilling precision. And there it was, Aconitum noctis. It was beautiful. That was the most sickening part. Tall, elegant spires of deep purple and blue flowers, shaped like a monk's hood. It looked regal, harmless. It looked like a lie. She stood there for a long time, just looking at it, the source of her stolen year. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, clarifying anger. She did not rip the plants out. That would be Riven's way, a violent purge. Her way would be different. She went back to Silas and asked for tools. For the next week, she spent every evening in that garden. She moved the night bloom plant by plant, replanting them all in one contained, stone-lined bed at the far end. She was corralling the threat, not eradicating it. Then, in the spaces she had cleared, She began to plant new things. She consulted with Alara. They chose plants based on their properties: white willow bark for blood pain, lavender for calming, comfrey for mending veins, angelica for strengthening the sire bond. Healing things. She was turning Isolde's poison garden into an apothecary's sanctuary. The physical labor was a balm. The ache in her muscles was a good ache. The ache of effort, not illness. It was proof of her own returning power. She would return to her rooms, hands stained with dark earth, and fall into the dawn rest deeply and dreamlessly. The court watched her. They saw her walking to the garden every evening. They heard the rumors. And their fear of her slowly transformed into respect. She wasn't just the king's beloved. She was the woman who tended the poison that had nearly destroyed her. One evening, Alara joined her in the garden. The healer carried a small, leather-bound journal. "I have been analyzing the financial records from Cassian's office," Alara said, her tone businesslike. "I found something strange. For the past 14 months, there were regular, untraceable payments made to a small alchemist's shop in the Mortal Quarter. The amounts were small, insignificant, easy to hide in the larger budget." Talia paused, wiping a smear of dirt from her forehead. "For Nightbloom." "No," Alara said, and her eyes were sharp. "That's the strange part. The payments were for Silverroot, an entirely different compound. It's a fast-acting nerve agent that affects mortals, not our kind. But I looked at the seller ledgers. Every time a payment was made for Silverroot, the Nightbloom in your draft was doubled." Talia felt a chill. Why would they buy a substance that doesn't even affect us? "I don't know," Alara admitted. Riven's investigators dismissed it. "They are not looking at the apothecary's bill." Talia stared at the neatly organized rows of herbs. Riven and his people saw the world in terms of power, territory, and overt threats. They had found the assassins and executed them. But she saw the world in patterns, in ledgers. The old guard had sneered at that mind. They hadn't considered that her common skills might catch them. They hadn't just been poisoning her. There was a parallel operation. The Silverroot payments were a variable. The picture wasn't complete. "Thank you, Alara," Talia said. "May I see those records?" That night, Talia didn't rest. She sat with the journal, a map, and records from the gatekeepers. She traced the money. She traced the dates. She found a name, the cellar hand who had blended her evening drafts. A quiet, unremarkable vampire named Petros, assigned to her preparations by Cassian. Petros had vanished 3 days after the purge. No notice, simply gone. In a court of immortals, it was itself a confession, and slowly a new picture began to emerge. The purge had not been total. He had cut off the head of the snake, but he hadn't found the nest. Philia, armed with a ledger and her own intimate knowledge, was walking right toward it. The tension between them had settled into a fragile truce. Riven kept his distance, a brooding, silent protector at the edge of her vision. The silence was heavy with unspoken things. He was waiting for her to come back to him, for her to forgive him. She knew she had to be the one to bridge the distance. He was trapped by his own guilt. She found him in the observatory at the highest point of the citadel. It was a circular room of dark stone and brass, with a massive telescope pointed at the sky. He was not looking through it. He was standing before the great arched window, his back to the room, looking out over the sleeping city below. 1,000,000 tiny lights, 1,000,000 mortal lives burning brightly and briefly. The moonlight caught his hair and turned it to spun silver. She stopped in the doorway, the journal clutched in her hand. Riven. He didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed. "Thalia, you should be resting." "I'm done resting," she said, walking into the room. "We need to talk." He finally turned. In the starlight, his face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, the silver hair framing features so perfectly wrought they bordered on cruel. His violet eyes were dark, bruised plum, the color of sleeplessness and guilt. "I hurt you," he said, his voice low. When you needed space, I smothered you. I am sorry. It was the admission she had been waiting for. Yes, you did, she agreed, her voice soft but unwavering. You were so focused on your guilt that you couldn't see my anger. And I needed my anger, Riven. It was the first sign that I was still in here. She pressed a hand to her chest. He flinched as if she'd struck him. But you have to stop trying to make it right, she continued. You can't. What happened is a part of me now, a scar. You can't heal it. All you can do is be with me while I learn to live with it. You have to trust me to be strong enough for that. Trust me? He laughed, bitter and self-deprecating. My trust is worthless. I trusted Cassian for 200 years. I failed you in every way. No, she said fiercely. She reached up and cupped his face, her palm against his cool, smooth skin. He went utterly still. He leaned into it with a shuddering sigh, his eyes closing. You believed me. You believed my weakness was real, and you loved me anyway. You didn't love me because I was powerful or useful. You loved me when you thought I was fading. Don't you see? That is the only thing that matters. His eyes opened, and they were bright with something she had never seen in them before, not in 3 centuries of marriage. It was not tears, their kind did not cry, but it was the closest thing to it, a shimmering, raw vulnerability that cracked the surface of that devastating face like light through stained glass. I felt you, through the bond, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Every night. I felt your exhaustion, your doubt, and I believed it was my fault, that I had done something wrong when I turned you, that my blood was not enough, that I was losing you. Something in her chest cracked open. You thought you were losing me? She said softly. And the bond just kept confirming it. It confirmed what I was afraid of, he said, not what was true. She understood then, with a clarity that was almost painful, the shape of the trap they had both been in. She believing her body was betraying her. He believing his blood was betraying her. 2 people in the same marriage, suffering the same lie from opposite sides, and the bond between them carrying the grief back and forth like a tide, amplifying it with every pass. She moved her thumb gently across his cheekbone. We were both in the trap, she murmured. A profound stillness came over him. His eyes searched hers, looking for the lie, for the pity. He found none. Now, she said, her tone shifting, becoming more resolute. I need you to trust me with this. She held up the journal. You cut off the head of the snake, but you missed the 4th conspirator. Riven's focus sharpened instantly. What are you talking about? Valerius, Isolde, and Cassian were the architects, she said, opening the journal. But they were old guard vampires. They think in terms of power, legacy, direct challenges. This poison was too subtle, too methodical, too patient. There was someone else involved, someone who understood how to poison a mind. She laid the journal open. Elara found payments for silver root, correlating with my dosage. Every time a payment was made, a merchant was granted entry. A half-blood alchemist from the mortal quarter named Master Corbin. Riven stared at the page. Corbin. I know the name. He's been supplying the Citadel for 50 years. He's beneath notice. That's exactly why it worked, she said. They would never associate with him publicly. He was beneath their contempt. And that made him invisible. He was the perfect tool, useful precisely because they despised him. But look at this. The silver root wasn't for me, it was a cover. They were using it on the horses in the stable, just enough to make them sick, so they could justify bringing a mortal quarter alchemist into the Citadel, to bring Master Corbin past the wards and the guards without suspicion. She pointed to another entry. Corbin was the one adjusting the dosage of the night bloom. He was the one advising them on how to keep me weakened but not destroyed. He was the expert. Riven was silent, his mind processing the intricate deception. It was a web of lies so mundane, so domestic, it was beneath the notice of a king. Poisoned horses, bad feed, a half-blood alchemist. It was brilliant. He lives between worlds, Riven said, the deeper implications settling over him. Not fully turned, not mortal. He sees angles we don't. He hated me, Thalia said, her voice flat. I remember him. The way he looked at me, at us, when he came to the Citadel. Contempt and envy in equal measure. A half-blood who could never be fully accepted, watching a woman from a lesser bloodline sitting beside the king. He wasn't trying to weaken the crown on behalf of the old guard. He was punishing me for having what he never could. Riven looked from the journal to her face. He saw not a victim, not a patient, but a partner. She had seen what he and all his ancient, powerful court had missed. She had used her mind, her meticulous eye for pattern, her intimate knowledge of the crime, and she had unearthed the final root of the rot. He slowly reached out and closed the journal. Where is he now? He's scheduled to make a delivery tomorrow evening, Thalia said, to the cellars. A new kind of silence fell between them. It was not the silence of guilt or distance. It was the shared, focused silence of two predators waiting for their prey. You have to let me be there, Thalia said. It was not a request. Riven looked at her, truly looked at her. At the strength in her eyes, the resolve in her jaw. The woman who had tended her own poison garden. He had been so afraid of her breaking, he hadn't realized she had been reforged. He gave a single nod. We will greet him together. In that moment, the last fractured pieces between them slotted into place. He wasn't her protector, and she wasn't his ward. They were a king and queen, and they were about to hold the final, terrible session of their court. Master Corbin was a slight man, meticulously dressed, with clever, restless eyes that held the telltale amber flecks of a half-blood. He carried a wooden crate filled with neatly bundled plants, his expression one of humble, professional deference as the guards escorted him into the small, private chamber off the main cellar. He entered and stopped short. The room was lit by a single candelabra. Riven was there, standing by the far wall, his arms crossed. His silver-white hair was unbound, falling past his shoulders like a mantle of frost. His violet eyes caught the candlelight and threw it back as something dangerous. He was beautiful the way a drawn blade is beautiful. But it was the other figure in the room that made Corbin's blood run cold. Thalia was sitting at a heavy table, a crystal goblet of deep crimson blood before her. She was not pale or tired. She looked radiant, her dark amber eyes sharp and clear. She looked powerful, impossibly powerful. Master Corbin, Riven said, his voice a pleasant, deadly purr. Thank you for coming. Corbin swallowed, his half-blood heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. My lord, I was not expecting... Lady Thalia. I am gladdened to see you looking so well. Thalia smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that held no warmth. I am feeling much better, thank you. The Citadel's blood supply seems to suit me after all. She took a delicate sip from her goblet, her eyes never leaving his. In fact, I've taken up a new hobby. Gardening. I've been restoring Lady Isolde's old botanical collection. Corbin's carefully constructed composure began to fray. He could feel the trap closing. Isn't it? Thalia continued, her voice light and conversational. It's fascinating work. So many interesting plants. For instance, did you know that silverroot, Argentum radix, while toxic to mortals, is completely harmless to our kind? But it causes a very specific set of symptoms in horses. Corbin's face had gone ashen. And then there's the night bloom, Thalia said, her voice dropping. The dosage is everything, isn't it? Too little, and there's no effect on a vampire's blood. Too much, and the blood dies, and with it, the vampire. But just the right amount, administered over time, it can make a vampire believe they are fading away. It's a very particular kind of cruelty. Wouldn't you agree, Master Corbin? The half-blood's nerve broke. He dropped the crate, herbs scattering. I don't know what you're talking about. Lady Isolde commissioned plants for research. I am a simple supplier. You are a poisoner, Riven said, his voice cutting through. He pushed away from the wall and took a single step forward. The temperature dropped and his violet eyes burned like cold fire. You conspired with members of my court to harm Lady Thalia. You advised them. You supplied them. You adjusted the dosage. You are as guilty as they are. They are dead, Corbin shrieked, terror shrill. They paid me. I did what I was told. You did more than that, Thalia said, standing up. She walked toward him, her steps measured and confident, with fluid grace. She stopped before him. You enjoyed it. You watched me wither, and you felt powerful. For once in your life, you had power over someone who had what you didn't you? Corbin was trembling, his eyes darting between them. He saw no escape. They deserve to die, Riven stated, his voice calm. And so do you. But your end will be different. Theirs was quick. A privilege of their station. He looked at Talia. What is your judgment? The question hung in the air. Talia looked at the sniveling, terrified half-blood, and the fire of her anger cooled into something else. Pity. Contempt. This was the architect of her stolen year? This small, bitter creature, motivated by petty jealousy? Death would be too easy. It would be an escape. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. She turned to Riven. Death is too easy. It's an escape. He doesn't get to escape. She turned back to Corbin. You will live. You will live out whatever years your half-blood constitution grants you. You will return to your shop, and you will continue to sell your little herbs. But you will carry something with you. She looked at Riven. The blood seal. Corbin's eyes went wide. He knew what it meant. Every half-blood did. Riven moved without hurry. He took Corbin's wrist and turned it palm up. He pressed his thumb to the inside of the man's forearm. There was no sound, no flash of light, just a faint hiss, like water on hot stone, and a mark bloomed on Corbin's skin. A dark, elegant sigil, permanent as bone. It would not fade. Every vampire who saw it would know its meaning. This life is held, not owned. Every night, for the rest of your life, you will remember this room, Thalia said, her voice quiet and absolute. Every vampire who crosses your threshold will see that mark and know exactly what you are. Not a martyr, not a villain, just a man who was shown mercy by the woman he tried to destroy. She bent down and picked up a single sprig of night bloom from the scattered herbs. She tucked it into his breast pocket with a gentle, terrible care. A souvenir, she said, to help you remember. Corbin stared down at the flower against his chest, then at the dark sigil on his forearm, and his last composure shattered. He backed away, stumbling, then turned and fled into the night. Thalia watched him go, then let the flower fall from her fingers. It was over. Truly over. She turned to Riven. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was awe. He was in awe of her strength, of her mercy, which was, in its own way, a far more profound and lasting form of cruelty. He closed the distance between them, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her hand, lacing his cool fingers with hers. He brought her hand to his lips, but he did not kiss it. He just held it there, against the cool, still line of his mouth, his violet eyes closed, dark lashes against pale skin. It was an act of fealty, an acknowledgement of her power, her authority, an apology and a promise, all in one silent gesture. They stood like that for a long time, in the quiet cellar, the scent of scattered herbs and ancient stone filling the air. The citadel was quiet. The ghosts were laid to rest. The war was finally over. Later that night, they walked together in the garden she had remade. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of lavender and the clean, earthy smell of damp soil. The moon was a silver sickle in the sky, illuminating the neat rows of healing herbs. At the far end of the garden, the contained bed of night bloom stood in deep shadow, a dark, silent monument to what had been overcome. Thalia stopped and looked up at the sky, taking a deep, clean breath. She felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the absence of weariness. It was the presence of peace. "I feel strong tonight," she said, the word simple, a statement of fact. Riven came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on the crown of her head. She felt the slow, singular beat of his heart against her back. Once, then the long silence, then once again. And she matched her own to it without thinking. They had done this for centuries, this unconscious synchronization. Two hearts that beat so rarely, finding each other's rhythm in the dark. It was the most intimate thing she knew. More intimate than any kiss, any confession. It was the sound of a marriage. "I missed this," he murmured into her hair. Not the holding, not the garden, this. The feeling of her, strong and present and here. Her blood humming with life. Her heartbeat steady and sure against the cage of his arms. For 14 months, her pulse had been thin and thready, a sound that had kept him awake through every dawn rest, counting the beats, terrified of the silence between them growing too long. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. The moonlight caught his face, that impossible, ruinous face, and she thought, as she had thought 10,000 times before, that it was unfair for anything to be that beautiful. The silver hair fell around his shoulders like a mantle of frost, and his violet eyes held the starlight the way dark water holds a reflection, faithfully and with a depth that could drown you. But tonight, it wasn't the beauty that held her. It was the small, barely perceptible crack in his composure, the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes, usually so controlled, so ancient, were bright with something that looked, in any other creature, like it might be tears. She reached up and smoothed the silver hair from his face, the way he had done for her so many times during her illness. The reversal was not lost on either of them. "We're all right," she said quietly. He pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closing. "Say it again. We're all right, Riven." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that carried the weight of 14 months of silent terror, and his arms tightened around her, pulling her close until there was no space between them, until she could feel the stillness of him, the ancient, enduring stone of him, and he could feel the warmth of her, returned at last. His silver hair fell around them both like a veil, and for a moment, in the quiet garden, they were the only two creatures in the world. She had lost 14 months of her life to a lie, but in finding the truth, in fighting her way back, she had found a strength she never knew she had. She had remade a garden, she had remade a court, and she had remade herself. The scars were there, and always would be. But scars were not a sign of weakness. They were proof that you had been wounded, and you had healed. And sometimes, rarely, preciously, they were proof that you had healed together. The night was deep and still around them, and their hearts beat slow and rare and perfectly in time. The silence between them was no longer a distance. It was a shared country. A place they had fought for, bled for, and finally, at last, reclaimed.